Is Instagram soft porn? This is a topic that I've wanted to share about for a long time, and it's something that I've taken a lot of time to ruminate on because I just know how sensitive this kind of conversation might be, and I want to extrapolate it in the best way that I can. Because anytime we talk about sexuality and start to make discernments about how we're using sexuality, because the sexual wound is the oldest wound in mine and many people's opinion, it brings up a lot. But this is something that's been on my mind a lot. And just to give you a bit of background, I'm someone who is in recovery from porn addiction. It's something that I've dealt with for a long part of my adult life. And thankfully, I'm in a place now where I have a very healthy relationship with my sexuality. But with any addiction, you're always in a state of recovery. There's always boundaries that have to be drawn, and you have to do some really, really hard shadow work to make sure you're safe from falling into these habits, these very self-destructive habits. It's really about taking responsibility for your life force. Now, it's interesting, in my healing of pornography addiction, I've been involved in many different methods and watched many different videos, read many books. And one thing that I've seen come up a lot is this notion, particularly around men who are much more affected by pornography addiction than women, that Instagram is kind of like the last stand for a lot of men with pornography addiction. And this is because Instagram seems somewhat innocuous. It's not like Pornhub, it's not a pornography site. But be that as it may, there is a lot of gratuitous sexuality on Instagram. Just me having to clean my Instagram feed constantly, just like any gratuitous sexual image, just closing it, saying I do not want to see these images more and more. Even when I've done that for weeks and weeks and weeks, there's still like algorithms that I don't even believe are about me personally. It's about just the idea that sex sells, and these social media platforms know that. All media platforms know that if you put a gratuitous sexual image in front of someone, be it a man or a woman, it's going to probably create a fairly strong response. And this is again because sexuality, the sexual wound, is really specifically about how repressed we are sexually. And sexuality is the most voluptuous, the most intense energy that we can feel in our lives, that force of attraction. It can overwhelm us so easily. Now, before I get into this a little deeper, I want to give a bit more of a context here because, part of this dilemma with gratuitous sexuality, definitely I see it a lot more with women. And I'm seeing a lot of women actually calling it out right now and starting to have this conversation, calling out their sisters, calling them in, saying, what are we doing here? We know that it's so easy to get more likes, get more followership if we show our bodies in a sexual way. And that's not to make a blanket statement saying, oh, there should be no such thing as nudity. I do believe that there's a certain quality of sharing one's body in a naked way that can be artful, that doesn't necessarily have that intention behind it to get likes, to get something from someone. It can just be tastefully showing that the human body is a beautiful thing. What I'm talking about is when there is a bit more of that edge of sort of turning on the sexiness vibe to get something from the people watching it, to get validation in some way, to get attention, to get eyes on you, to get more and more likes. I've seen this in myself. I started playing around with, hey, what would happen if I, showed my butt when I was doing a morning yoga practice, and like, whoa, the amount of likes was like mind blowing to me. And I noticed after that I was kind of like attracted to this idea. Oh, maybe I need more likes today. Maybe I should show a picture of my butt or something like that. Just wow. So I could see it in my own life. And this isn't to blame anyone. This is just taking stock of where we're at in our shadows, in our woundedness as human beings, trying to clumsily figure out what is a more integrous way to live. Now, when we're talking about, this whole idea of sex, pornography addiction, I want to share something that's really, really been mind-blowing for me. So in my studies of tantric sexuality, which has been a huge part of my recovery, sacred sexuality as well, there's this really interesting thread that came out in particularly the books of Diana Richardson, and her husband, Michael Richardson, also co-writes some books with her. They're both students of Osho, and they have, in my mind, one of the most simple and concise explanations of sexuality. They have a beautiful book called Heart of Tantric Sex, if you want to read that as a backgrounder. Now, what I found really interesting in this is in the whole realm of sacred sexuality and Tantra, there is this idea of using sex in a more slower, dispassionate way, because the whole goal, one of the primary goals rather, of sacred sexuality and tantric sex is to be more orgasmic, not to be so fixated on the orgasm. And this is another reason that explains, the repression of our sexuality and why we get into these traps of using our sexuality to get things. We are a dopamine deficient culture. And a lot of this is because when we have an orgasm, this is for men and women, you actually have an explosion of dopamine in your brain. Dopamine is a very powerful neurochemical that really controls our ability to feel content with the small things in life, like taking a sip of coffee, smelling the roses. It keeps you in that baseline of just feeling pleased with life, of being able to feel pleasure in an easeful and graceful way. When we have an orgasm, we have this profound explosion of dopamine in our brain, but it's like an excess of dopamine. And what happens is we go into a deficiency of dopamine for 2 weeks on average. 2 friggin' weeks. That's a long, long time. Now, some of the symptoms of being dopamine deficient is the grass is always greener syndrome. And this is explained because one of the things that they found that can only spike dopamine back up to equilibrium is novelty. So you might have an amazing passionate night of sex with your lover, you have an orgasm, and then the next morning you're kind of like, I don't know if I'm as attracted or as in love with this person anymore. Now, before you start making judgments about yourself, you may want to step back and realize that's because maybe your dopamine's in deficiency. Our dopamine's also just under attack because there's so much excessive stimulation going around, and all of our neurochemistry gets completely out of whack, especially with all the screen time and all these hyper images and visuals that we get. So that's just really something to consider. And this is actually why pornography addiction, people tend to downward spiral. They may start looking at what they may deem more conventional sex, but then all of a sudden they have an orgasm, and then the next time they open up their computer to engage in pornography, they found themselves needing something more gratuitous, more intense, something more different, something more strange. And before they know it, they're masturbating to all kinds of stuff that is totally outside of their own disposition, and that can lead to lots of shame and confusion when all they really needed to do was really realize that there's this neurochemical imbalance happening when they have an orgasm. So why I'm putting that out there is with the whole realm of sacred sexuality and tantra, they're trying to really harmonize this inner system. It's not only healing this dopamine cycle, it's also realizing that when we have an orgasm, the sex act usually stops. And there are tons of other gradations and levels of sex that can happen when we start to build the capacity to hold more and more pleasure. When we don't have an orgasm and we relax into it, we can actually go for much longer. We can have crazy amounts of pleasure, even divine feelings of pleasure, as is legendarily alluded to or testified in a lot of these tantric and sacred sexuality books, and something I hope we all can experience for ourselves. I have experienced it. It is absolutely amazing. I think all humans should be educated on this. Now, the thread that I want to pick up on is in Diana Richardson's book. She has this very interesting discussion about the responsibilities of men and women to really engage a skillful sacred sexual act. Because the thing is, if we're going to actually choose to not be about the destination of orgasm and really prolong things, we want to be a little more dispassionate. We don't want to go so fast and animalistic because that'll just hyperstimulate us, leaving us much more vulnerable. So there is an onus on men and women. So for instance, they talk about how the sex act should really begin with men fondling, caressing, kissing the woman's breasts. And this is because This is the electric center of the woman. This is like what turns on her heart, opens up her love. And there are actually channels that go directly from her heart into her vagina or yoni. And the man is only supposed to enter when her yoni is wet, when there's this kind of like assenting from her body, which will be a sign that he's opened her, particularly with the love. And I love this context because it really says that love is the leader. Love is the leader in sacred sexuality. And it's also about awareness. As I think Osho famously said, love with awareness, or sex with awareness equals love. That's just how easy it is. The more aware you are of your body, slowing things down, allowing the sensitivity of the body to be amplified, it becomes so much more joyful. So that is one of the onus on men, is to actually help women with a lot of foreplay feel open, because it can also be really painful if he penetrates her without getting her yoni properly lubricated. So that's the responsibility of men. And of course, this is in a heterosexual context. Now, what Diana Richardson says about women, and this is to really bring it all into this idea of Instagram as a soft porn, they say that women's responsibility is to just slow down their titillation of men. Because if a woman is on top of men, she's riding him and she's making all kinds of sounds, it can be really hard for a man to restrain himself from having an orgasm. So Diana actually says that women have to learn to take a bit of a step back. That doesn't mean you can't have wild and amazing sex, but sacred sexuality is about a slower form of sex, moving more gentle, moving more softer. And the paradox is you're actually feeling way more because you're almost like meditating and your attention is so fixated on the feelings in your genitals. You're using your breath to expand these feelings throughout the body and circulate it, that it can become way more pleasurable than a quickie that's very passionate and animalistic. So what I really want to ultimately get to here is something that I've been thinking about and talking about a lot recently is patriarchy is only going to be transformed with men and women coming together and doing this work. We can't do it alone. And to me, sexuality is one of the great nexus points where a lot of this patriarchal distortion is happening. So if we can start to really have these conversations and heal this, we are going to be doing amazing evolutionary steps to heal and dismantle patriarchy. So to circle back to the whole idea of Instagram as soft porn, I really just want to open up this conversation because I know a lot of men, including myself, who are having to really like take a step back from things like Instagram because there's so many women using their sexuality to get likes and attention. And we really need to have a conversation here because I don't think that's healthy for women as well. There's a lot of metaphysical distortions happening around sex. And particularly when I've had partners in the past, if they've put sexual images of themselves on Instagram, it really concerns me because I know there might be people looking at those images, self-pleasuring, masturbating, and sending a lot of sexual energy towards them. And we don't understand this metaphysical realm at all. And our culture, because it's so cut off from the mystical and the metaphysical, but if you delve into esoteric stuff, they talk a lot about how these sexual forces play a huge role in the subtle energetics of our reality. And so we might want to just like have more control over our sexual energy so that we're not attracting some of these astral forces that are quite parasitic actually, and they're really drawn to sexual energy because it's such a profound energy. Interestingly enough, there is an esoteric teaching in sacred sexuality called the Nymphian that says when couples come together in loving bonded sex, they create a force field around themselves called the Nymphian that actually makes them invisible to all negative astral influences. Really, really profound to think about that. And, I'll give an interesting example years ago because something that a lot of people are struggling with in monogamous partnerships is fidelity. How can we say faithful to this person for the rest of our lives? I'm a monogamist. I love having long relationships, bonded relationships with one partner. And really one of my last partners where this pornography addiction was a huge part of why our relationship ended. I just couldn't get a handle on it, caused a lot of destruction. in the relationship. And she rightfully was really angry, that I was leaking out and looking at other women. I was always in this like overly titillated, sexual, lustful energy. And I remember having a conversation with her one day about, gosh, we need to really bring the men's and women's circles together. It would be so much easier if we had an understanding between men and women that a lot of this sexual titillation that's happening on social media is really not helping this situation of getting men liberated from pornography addiction. And it was really interesting. She was really triggered, understandably so. Women have suffered so much, and I'm not trying to like control female bodies. I'm trying to open up a conversation about this. And it was just really ironic that she was getting really angry at me. And then I just noticed on my Instagram feed that she just posted a picture of herself naked in a way that was like somewhat gratuitous. So it's like kind of the scenario of like, hey, stop doing the heroin while putting a bag of heroin on the table. So I don't necessarily have, a conclusive answer on this. I just think it's a very interesting conversation that we need to have to figure out how can we come together, because pornography addiction is such a huge problem. It's robbing so many couples from reaching heights of sexual bliss, from having very long-standing relationships. And it's going to take work on both sides to really get this going on. Because I know a lot of women are like, I'm going to just show sexual images of myself on Instagram. And they kind of point the finger at men and say, hey, control yourself. It's up to you to just control yourself and to be okay with that. And for sure, there's definitely a level where men can get, where they can walk around in public, see attractive women, breathe them in, as Data says. It's totally healthy to be attracted to other women, but you can just breathe them in energetically and breathe it out. The minute you start fixating in your mind, you're kind of going down the line of infidelity. That being said, I think if you talk to most men who have overcome pornography addiction, sexual addiction, they will probably tell you at a certain point they had to severely discipline, if not altogether, get rid of things like Instagram. So we really need to talk about this. This is a problem. I'm really open to people sending their comments, their feedback, and I'm hoping to really have more conversations with women about this. I've done some men's and women's circles in the past on this subject. Really, really interesting stuff. And remember, patriarchy, again, is only going to be transformed with men and women coming together and doing this work. When we start to see all the wounds that are happening that patriarchy has done to both men and women, really the ultimate antidote for it is building a partnership-based culture. Now, I don't mean necessarily having romantic, intimate partnership. I mean men and women partnering in a co-creation of a new vision of society and culture where they're both equanimous, they're both in mutual honoring of each other and reverence, and also just leaving you with this thought that we need to understand each other's wounds. Men's and women's circles have been really doing their amazing work exclusive of each other, but now it's time to come together and get curious about what are the wounds that each other have and how can we mutually come together to support us, because we can't do it alone. It's really just impossible. And you just reach a stage where you can do a lot of healing, but to get to the next level, it's about men and women coming together and doing this work. Be glorious.